or evening, I suppose.
Thank you very much. No, it's afternoon. It's 4 o'clock.
All right. That's cool. So you're in music as well?
I do, yeah. I'm at the learning stage, but with the recording game. But I can play. Thank you very much. No, it's afternoon. It's 4 o'clock.
All right. That's cool. That's cool. So you're in music as well?
I do, yeah. I'm at the learning stage, but with the recording game. But I can play. Thank you very much. No, it's afternoon. It's 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
All right.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I think we just had some feedback coming from Thomas because he is recording.
Got it.
Okay, but I think we're all set. Cool. So, well, let's just wait a few more minutes just for some more people to join. How you doing, Justin? How's the quarantine?
Whew, ups and downs, but I have a terrace, which I'm very fortunate about. So I go out there in the morning, I play my guitar, stretch a little bit. I've been stepping up my cooking game big time, which is great, and I've also been freakishly productive in terms of my own music. So overall, could be worse, but obviously you just got to make the best of the situation. So
yeah.
What about you?
Well,
you got
I'm
a lot
in
of
Berlin.
books right there, man.
Yeah, this is actually
Mr.
my
Study?
mom. This is my mom's room.
She's like, Max, I didn't know you were so studious.
I know, exactly. No, just making myself look clever.
Yeah.
My mom's a university professor. What's that?
I said you look very clever with all those books.
Thank you. If I put on these glasses.
Dude, you look like you're writing your opus with the hair and everything, man. You look like you've been up all night trying to figure out the secrets.
Exactly. So I don't know who else is.
Well, actually, I got an Instagram message from someone that said they were going to be joining.
Okay.
So I know that guy's coming.
Well, look, I mean, we might as well get started. I'm sure Becky has a ton of questions for Justin.
Yeah.
Justin, is there anything that that you had in mind in terms of like maybe stuff that you felt students often ask questions about, or something that you wanted to share in particular, or otherwise you can just
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's one thing. If there's one thing that I feel is always a useful thing to hear for students and for new producers, or even for people that are like an intermediate and almost advanced level, it's really just that there's this kind of, once you start learning about music production, right, and you start learning about the intricacies of it and all of the possibilities, right? I think one of the tendencies is to feel that in order to make something that is professional sounding, you need to be doing something complex, right? And it almost feels like you're wary when you do something good that's simple. But the truth is that the higher level you get, the more simple what's going on actually ends up being. Not in terms of the musical construction necessarily, right? But in terms of the actual like instrumentation, in terms of the actual mix itself, right? So, it's not really about like how can I make something super complex? It's more about how can I start with something that's great and make it a little bit better. And so I'm a big proponent of just like wherever you're at in the music production, music making process, that getting that into your head and accepting that and really realizing that actually at the highest level, that's what you strive for anyway, is the thing that's going to put you the furthest down the line, right? So that's like one of the reason that, a lot of electronic music producers use analog synthesizers and use drum machines and stuff, right? There's this kind of interesting balance that we have right now in the world of professional audio and professional music, where you have access to places like Splice. There are a lot of services like that exist, splice, of course, being the most foremost, where you can get samples, you can get loops, and you can start. And the whole idea with those is that they're production ready. And so with that, what that actually means is that in theory, you can drag that in and not touch it, and it sounds like it's done and ready for the track, right? And so that's one major advantage that we have right now, especially if you're working as a newer producer. Why is that a huge advantage? Well, on the one hand, you don't actually have to know how to be a master mixing engineer, right? So you're going to get sounds that are perfect, conceivably, that are perfectly mixed, that are ready to just be thrown in and blended with other things, right? Now, that being said, one of the problems with this is that a lot of these sounds come completely pushed to their limit, right? They're already as loud as possible, which means that you have no wiggle room to do any dynamics processing, right? So on the one hand, there's something to be kind of aware of over there, right? Which is that if you're using samples, it's actually better to just take more time choosing the right sample than to mess with the sample trying to get it the way that you want it to sound, right? So on the other side of it, you have the benefit, therefore, of doing things from scratch, but also the difficulty, right? So synthesis is really hard. I'd say, honestly, it took me probably 5 or 6 years to become to become genuinely good at synthesis, right? Now, I'm not saying that it has to take 5 or 6 years. I also was like very foolish and didn't seek out other resources. But having the ability to craft at least close to what you're hearing in your head is really important. Why is that important? Well, presets are all well and good in synths, right? But a lot of the times they're not quite what you're looking for, right? So you end up doing a little bit of EQing or a little bit of saturation or a little bit of maybe, 9 things in a row and, 4 audio effects tracks and whatever it is, right? And at the end of the day, it really is just going to sound better if you make the thing that you clearly want to do. So my main piece of advice, right, my main number one thing that I always try to explain to everyone is, the sound that you start with should be as close to the sound that you want to finish with. Yeah. Now, with that being said, you can ask questions about that and anything else that you want.
Great. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
Hey, Tristan, how's it going? Hey, Maya. Nice to see you.
Hey, what's up?
Hi.
Nice to be here.
So why don't we've got such a small group. Why don't we just do a quick intro? Maya, so Maya was one of our students. You were one of our first songwriting students, I believe, back in January last year. Give us a little intro on your musical journey and what brings you here and anything you want to share with the group.
Oh, wow. I'm going to try to be really short. 'Cause I'm the oldest one here. I could put a few of you together and it would be me. So I've had a long life of being in and out of music. I grew up in a household with a composer, performer, professor, conductor father. He studied with Nadia Boulanger, who was my godmother. And so it's mostly classical music, and I grew up with also very experimental music because my dad founded the electronic music studio at Sarah Lawrence College in 1969, before most of you were born, probably, except for one person, maybe. You, yeah. It'd be weird if we could see who's looking at us. So anyway, that's sort of like the fundamental where I'm coming from. And then I also studied many instruments when I was young. And I'm particularly drawn to piano and drums. And I don't play piano anymore, even though I studied for 5 years. So then I dropped it for many years, became a hip hop dancer. And about 20 years ago, picked up, I was using a sampler to write songs, an ASRX. And I was drumming a djembe. I played djembe. And put it down again for about 15 years. So I'm back, lots of life experience, which you hear in my lyrics. And so now, I really wanted to learn how to make my own songs on the computer. I made demos, but I was never really quite happy with the music I was getting or the beats or anything. So think I'd still like to collaborate, actually. You know, I'm seeing now the more I do it, because it takes too long. It's much better now, Max, than it ever was. You know, I could put something together, but now I'm really interested in processing and all that. And Justin, I went to your lecture about 6 weeks ago.
I remember. Yeah.
And then I went to the mixing in the box thing the other night on YouTube. And I just feel like both of you mentioned, for example, Valhalla vintage verb. So I checked that out, and I looked into the Chris Lord Algae vocal processor that he was, I don't know how to pronounce that guy's name, and Shadow Hills and Master Bus Compressor, and sort of like playing with the demo because it's really expensive. So that's kind of where I'm at now. I've got tons and tons of songs nearly finished, and I need to learn completion. Like, how do I know when I'm done? Thanks.
That's a difficult thing to know when you're done.
Awesome, great. And then let's just move over to Tristan, and then we will continue with the questions.
Can you guys hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'm Tristan. I record as Metamither. I've been hanging out at 343 pretty much quite a bit.
Yep.
I just finished up the mixing and mastering class with Abe, which I really got a lot out of, just not only in terms of strengthening concepts that I sort of vaguely knew about, but also just kind of getting the right tools for the job, like just becoming aware of like a lot of plugins and stuff like that, that honestly, you know, just make a huge impact. I'm definitely seeing the growth in my music over the last 12 months for sure. I'm working on sort of my second EP, which is sort of nearing completion. I'm pushing forward on tracks just because I'm inside all day long. So yeah, that's basically me in a nutshell.
Okay, sweet. I think we had actually, so we're actually streaming to YouTube as well. And there was a question that just came in from Blank Poster. So I'm just going to read that question out, Justin.
All right.
So Blank Poster writes, I have a question with a background story. I have been trying to produce since the last 10 years, but I have been unable to produce, for that matter, learn the DAW Ableton completely. I always have that worry. I don't know this terminology. What should I do? I struggle with workflow. How do I get that going? So I guess, you know, he's been producing for 10 years, but it's been hard for him to learn the DAW. And he struggles with workflow. What would you suggest for someone like that?
Definitely. So, you know, the first step is, you know, I've at the school taught various levels, you know, from beginner to intermediate, and then have had students who are a little bit more advanced. And so the number one thing with the DAW, right, is that it really is a language. So you have to kind of treat it like learning a language, you know? And I, at this point, having gone through the educational process myself, actually, in the past, where I spent a lot of time kind of, you know, self-taught, picking up tips here and there, when I went into an actual educational environment, it blew my mind how quickly I learned. So if you're still struggling to learn the DAW after that much time, what that means to me is that you probably actually have a pretty high level of familiarity with it, but there's some basic things that you just never quite learned. Certain things that you might not even know are there, you know? So I would recommend, honestly, taking a class or a workshop or something, even here at like 343. I know we offer a lot of great stuff with that. And in terms of workflow, a little different, of course. Can't really take a class on workflow. So what I do recommend, though, is that I'm a big believer, you know, in once you start something, try to see it as far as it can go. So there's a lot of the best, for instance, mix engineers and producers have this kind of commitment to committing, actually. And so I'm on the same boat, right? If I write something that catches my interest and I emotionally connect to, right? I immediately start working on it. I don't try to fish for other ideas that are more attractive to me, right? Or alternatively, it's also really important to know if you're actually not in the headspace to be working on something, you know? So, for instance, in this quarantine period that we've been having here, you know, the first week and a half, I was like aggressively composing so much. And it was like this crazy burst, you know. I think a lot of it had to do with the new environment and a lot of the emotions that were floating around, you know. And I felt crazy inspired and I felt like it was never going to go away. And in the last 4 or 5 days, I'm having a much harder time with that. And the thing is that instead of banging my head against the wall, I've actually allowed myself space, you know, so I can work on it a little bit. But I think a really important thing with workflow, right, is on the one hand, when you know, catch the bug, so to speak, when you have the fire, it's really important to work on the idea, right? So with production and particularly in the box, right? I think one of the hangups for workflow is processing actually. So you have to kind of recognize what level you're at as a producer and be honest and realistic with yourself, right? If you're able to record a sound or make a sound or to drag in a sample, whatever it is, however you're sourcing your sounds and your ideas, right? If you're able to do that and make it sound basically its final product within 2 minutes, then that's okay. If it takes you more than 2 minutes to do that, you should ignore that process at the start of your composition, right? And so, even for me, so I do a lot of live tracking, right? Where I actually record with physical microphones and stuff. And the whole point with that is, you know, I have to commit to a sound, but also, you know, there's a lot more problems when you record things live. Like you can hear the problems that you need to fix, but I even ignore those. You know, I'm a big believer that like you should really separate the pure creativity from the more like technical creativity, right? Unless you're able to marry those two in an extremely seamless way, which is only really possible once you're at a more advanced level, I really can't recommend enough that like, you know, I can't tell you how many times over the years I got, you know, 2 minutes and 42 seconds of a perfect song that I had no idea where to take it, right? I like produced it and mixed it and it sounded amazing, but like who cares? Because the idea wasn't there, right? At the end of the day, when it comes to workflow, you always just have to focus on the music. Try to force yourself to finish the arrangement, you know? The thing is that even if you're like, I don't find this quite inspiring yet, a lot of what I do for workflow is if I'm struggling to figure out how to get from point A to point B, but I know what point B is supposed to be, I actually create point B. And then I work like backwards. I kind of slowly fill out the spaces, right? So I believe that there's nowhere does it say you have to work chronologically. You know, if you're writing a song, nowhere does it say you have to write your verse first. You know, you could write your outro first if that's what comes to you. It's just more about following your creativity and allowing yourself to focus on the creativity and not, does this sound like a complete song? It can't sound like a complete song. You just started, you know? So that's the most important thing I think in terms of workflow. Because you know, everyone's workflow is different, so it's really, really hard to give concrete advice on that, but that would be my kind of general advice. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Justin. Anyone have any questions about what Justin just said now? Otherwise, we can move on to the next question. Cool. Maya, do you want to go?
Go what?
Do you anything you want to ask, or what do we do?
No, not at the moment. I mean, I'm glad you said that, Justin, because that's exactly how I work. You know, sometimes it comes straight through the whole thing, and now it's much more organized than it used to be. But I'm sort of looking at production issues. But I think I've learned between last year. I started writing actually songs on my phone about 2 years ago. But I only started learning Ableton by jumping into the songwriting class without the formal class. So like I'm still learning stuff, but to trust that and to allow it to come through however it wants to. And so that's extremely helpful to give myself permission to do that. So
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, that was good to hear you say that that's okay to do. Yeah.
Cool. Well, why don't we just raise hands? Becky or Tristan, do you have any questions?
How do you recommend processing guitars electric guitars.
It's
Hmm.
like probably my favorite thing to do. So it really depends on the source. You know, the first question is, are you going DI or are you recording with an actual amplifier, right? So there's going to be a number of different things that you have to take into account. So I would ask you, are you using are you plugging directly into your interface and then doing an amp modeling simulation, or do you have like, an amplifier that you're miking up?
DI.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's actually a good thing
Yeah.
because you're gonna have less problems, right? The bad thing about that potentially, right, is just you have to do a little bit more work to like make it feel like your guitar recording, the one thing that, for my money, you still can't quite capture is that electrical feeling of literally what happens the moment that the pick or your fingers hit the string. And there's that little jolt, of brightness and sharpness and color. Um, there's great amp sim technology though. So what amp simulation are you using, if any?
I've got one by Brainworks. I can't
Okay.
remember what it's called.
So I would before I
Yeah.
before I had an amp that I was satisfied with for recording, I was using an amp simulation by this company called Positive Grid, which I think is probably the best one. There are many good ones, but I think that one sounds like freakishly realistic, to be honest. And so the thing with guitar processing is there's so many little tricks. So I don't normally say this because I think YouTube is a very confusing landscape, but you can find some amazing guitar production stuff on YouTube. Now, particularly, there's a channel called Produce Like a Pro that's run by a Grammy-winning producer and engineer. That every piece of information he's giving you is like solid. Now, that being said, I'll still tell you a bunch. So, for rhythm guitars, there's this big secret that once you figure it out, you might already know it. It's going to completely change the way that you produce guitars, which is something called double tracking. So the cool thing about recording a live instrument source, right, is that it's physically impossible to replicate the exact same audio waves twice. You could have a master, a true master of guitar, in every sense possible, and they still wouldn't be able to completely perfectly replicate what they played, right? There's so many subtle nuances that are going to be different. And so one trick that we use for producing guitars is you record let's say you're doing a rhythm track, you record your rhythm playing and you pan it all the way to the left. And then you record it again, like you play it all again, and then you pan it to the right. And you get this huge signal, right? So now if you mess up at all, if there are, rhythmic discrepancies, timing discrepancies, by all means, you should correct that. But actually, part of the beauty of this is that there are inconsistencies. And so it makes the tone waver a little bit. And that's like really cool. Now, within that technique, there are actually other things that you could also do. So you could, for instance, record with your tone, you record with a different pickup actually for one side and record with a different pickup for the other one. So a lot of the times, I have a Fender, and I'll start with the bridge pickup, and then I'll flip it around and I'll play the other one, right? And then I'll hard pan those differently. And that gives you this really interesting different tone, right? If you have this ability, you also could do it with two different guitars. That, of course, necessitates owning two different guitars. If that's a luxury that you have, then I would even go that route. Then you get really interesting, colorful tones. Now, this is a technique that can quickly run out of control, right? You should not double track everything. The point is to double track kind of what you want to feel the biggest. But particularly with guitars, layering is a huge secret. So even if you play like some lead, that's maybe like a cool distorted lead, but for whatever reason it feels like it's not strong enough in the mix, right? You could just record it again and just layer it right behind it and right under it. And as long as your playing is like fairly close, it actually gives it this really cool sort of indescribable, like otherworldly likeness to it. Now, something that's important to do with guitars when you're going DI is whenever you're trying to simulate a real instrument, unless you're specifically going for a DI tone, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. Like, there are plenty of people that like that sound. But if you want to get a slightly more like realistic classic guitar sound, one thing that you're going to want to emulate is the signal flow of a studio, right? So in a studio, right, in a recording situation, the very first place that the signal starts is the guitar amp, right? So you want to make sure that you don't have any processing going on before the guitar amp, unless it's effects, right? Because you're going to have your pedal board before the amplifier. So that's something that's really cool, right? You could throw effects. They don't even have to be pedals. You could just put like a Sound Toys Echo on there or something, whatever it may be, you know. Put the effects before the amp, generally speaking. Then what you would do is I like to actually take some sort of plugin that has a preamp simulation on it. So if you have universal audio, which I know you do actually, that's like the greatest place to start, you know? So what I would do is I would purposely overdrive the preamp a little bit. And so that doesn't mean that every time I strum, I get crackle and distortion, but what it means is that on my highest peaks, I do. And this gives you a very classic, realistic sounding distortion tone. And then what I would do is after the preamp, then I would start EQing, compressing, and doing whatever else I would, you know, need to do. Generally speaking, by the way, don't compress guitars. They sound badass when they're not compressed. They're supposed to be open and flowing. Yeah, so that would be my recommendation on guitars.
Thank you.
Great. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing, Justin. Really, really helpful. And obviously, Justin is a great resource for this because he plays guitar and does vocals and is an awesome producer. So I think it's one of the harder things to be a producer and be good inside your DAW, but then also know how to work with live instruments. So that's really helpful. Thank you. Tristan, I'm sure you have loads of questions.
I wanted to ask about like sort of reference tracks. And I found that when I was working on stuff in the class and, just when I brought stuff in for the feedback session, sometimes the 343 speakers would sound quite different than my home studio. And, discounting like, okay, maybe my room and the space is not the issue and I'm still kind of like learning stuff. The sort of, I was wondering about like the functions of like reference tracks versus if you have any other kind of plugins that could help you sort of evaluate the signal and kind of what you're creating on just like an analytical level so that I could kind of sort of try to get the best possible sounding thing and sort of know roughly what I'm getting if I bring it into 343 and not sort of have as many surprises.
For sure. So, I mean, yeah, that's really like the ultimate I don't have $1 million studio question, So you're not alone in that, man. I'm sitting in front of very, very expensive high-end nice speakers with all sorts of really crazy outboard gear for mixing and mastering, right? Nice preamps and all this stuff. And at the end of the day, if I only sit in this room and produce it and only listen on these speakers, I will not get the proper result, right? So one of the number one things that you can do, first of all, is just constantly be kind of cycling between listening mediums. So you probably have headphones, right? So I have a general rule. I don't spend any more than 15 minutes on headphones if I'm doing a mixing thing. Reason for that being is just your depth perception gets completely thrown off when you're in headphones, especially if you're changing the volume up and down. So if you're in the headphones, it's really important to actually not change the volume while you're mixing. On speakers, it's a little bit different. Overall, though, that's also just something that I believe in is like you should not be monitoring super loud and then super quiet, right? Monitor kind of at a medium level, turn it up for, literally 10 seconds. Like sometimes I will crank it for 10 seconds just to see what it feels like, and then I turn it back down, One of the best tricks I ever learned is low-level monitoring, though. What I mean by that is you actually basically turn the track down as much as possible to the point that you can barely hear it. Whatever you hear is the loudest element in your mix, right? So what this also does is it takes away the room effect, you know? So the louder you mix, the roomier the sound is that you're hearing. The lower you mix, the more, you know, fidelity to the actual source you're getting from your speakers. Now, with all that being said, having a reference source is extremely useful, right? There's a bunch of reasons why. First of all, as we were just discussing, the reference source is going to respond to your room in the same way that your track is, right? So assuming that that track is well mastered, that actually means whatever is happening there is probably the right thing that should be happening. There are a couple of really good resources on like metering that are also useful. So Isotope's tonal balance control is extremely useful. That models basically different tonal profiles for different styles of music, particularly the new one. They have like eight or nine styles of music. And what you can also do is you can load in a song and get a custom profile. Now, as with all metering, right? Metering should guide your ears. It should never be your ears, right? So at the end of the day, you know what it sounds like, right? So using the reference track, using metering, all should be things to guide you towards the point to where you're going, right? But at the end of the day, it's going to sound good on more different mediums if you test it on more different mediums. So the guy that taught me mix engineering, that taught me a lot about production, this is like 11 years ago at this point, right? This guy named Dave Darlington, you can look him up. He is multi-Grammy award-winning mix engineer. He's like one of the spokespeople for Waves, you know, does like their like how to make your 808s bang, you know, videos and stuff like that or whatever. And what he had in his studio, which most top engineers have, was a pair of broken mono speakers. They literally sounded terrible. But the thing is that if it sounded good on there, it was amazing. And so to have a really bad pair of speakers that you can test it on is important. Now, it's also important to be able to test it on mediums that you know what things are supposed to sound like. For me, as weird as this may sound, I actually listen to a lot of music off my laptop speakers. And so I know exactly what music should sound like on my laptop. In fact, when it comes to mixing vocals, one of my ultimate tests for levels is to hear what it sounds like on the laptop. To get it tucked exactly the way I want it, usually I actually have to turn on the laptop speakers and I go, oh, wow, that was like 2 decibels too quiet, or like, whoa, that was way too loud, right? So usually towards the end of my mix process, right, I bounce out what's called like a, you know, mix check. And that's kind of that's me going, I know there might still be problems, so I'm not going to commit and like make my brain go crazy by saying, this is the final mix, you know, and then freak out when it's not good. So I literally test it on my iPhone. I test it on my computer speakers. I test it on my consumer headphones. I test it on my Apple earbuds. If I have a car, I test it in the car. Anywhere that you can test it. And then what you kind of do is like, you know, take notes, whether physically or mentally, of like, okay, in the car, it sounded really boomy. But then on my consumer headphones, maybe it sounded like a little bit weak in the low end or something, right? And so then you try to kind of use that empirical evidence to go back to your session and be like, oh, okay, overall, this area is probably a problem. I can clean that up a little, you know? Yeah.
Hey guys, thanks Justin. That's awesome. We might be cut off just because there's a time limit on this meeting, but if that happens, we just updated it. We will just jump on this link, which I'm sharing with you now. Please copy it down. So we may, hopefully we won't get cut off, but if we do, just click on that and we'll continue the conversation there. Sound good?
Yeah.
Did you all get it? Yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, did that answer your question, Tristan, or was there more?
Yeah. I realize it's a huge topic, you know, so.
Yeah. What kind of speakers do you have?
I have like really basic like Mackie 5s.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if it's a matter of updating. I mean, I just got the 990 headphones, which are really great, but it's also like awesome. I'm learning those, you know, and what those sound
exactly.
like. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really about learning your monitoring situation.
Yeah, and I mean the plugins that I've just gotten in the past like 3 months have just leveled up anyway. So it's all just, you know, It's all just happening. It's just time, really, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Yeah, Maya.
I mean, I had a question. So I don't play any live instruments into Ableton, into a DAW, but I mean, I've played with it and I'm thinking about, drums and stuff like that. But you're talking about the guitar, and sometimes I don't play guitar or anything like that, but it's kind of fantastic in some tracks. But there are things like what you were talking about, and amping it and so forth, but things for me like transients,
Hmm.
kind of are the things that are really important to me. And do you have any suggestions for kind of shaping, the attack, for example, or
So do you mean like
like,
transients is in like the strum of the guitar, the attack of
yeah,
the note?
yeah.
So
Also
okay.
the up and down, like how do you just reverse something, or when
Wait,
you
the up
have
and
that up,
down.
when you're
Wait,
strumming
do
down,
you mean simulating a guitar?
yeah, I guess if you want to make it sound more realistic, or just using samples, maybe would that be the better?
Well, in terms of the up and down, that has to be in the guitar playing. If that's not in there, then there's not really like guitar is one of the only instruments you can't really fake. I mean, you can. It just takes like genuinely hours of work.
So it's really better maybe just to use samples and not
Either
these.
use a sample or just record it yourself. You know, the beauty of like live playback DAWs, right? Or rather, of stop playback DAWs is like you can be Jimmy Page if you want to take the time to play every note exactly the way you want it, and like arrange them. Obviously,
Mm.
gonna be a little bit of a difference still, but like, yeah, I mean, I'm like I'm fairly good at the guitar, but sometimes what I'm trying to do, I need to be able to do it just in isolation and